open up our Bibles. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. This is the apostolic credentials that Paul is giving about himself. He's comparing himself to the false apostles in Corinth. He is showing that he is superior to him. They are messengers of Satan. They're disguised as angel of lights. They're deceivers. They're liars. And people listened to them, which is crazy. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 26. And Paul has to defend himself. And it's too bad. Paul doesn't want to defend himself. As you noticed, as we went through chapter 11 and much of chapter 12, Paul kept saying, you know what, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. Paul's a very humble guy. And this is going to come off as sounding like he's a proud person. Pride is the seat of all sin. If you think of any sin, you can trace it back to pride. And when we think about Satan and you think about what the Bible says that Satan fell. Why did Satan fall? Satan fell because of his pride. And when you look into Isaiah, I think it is, I'm pretty sure it is, it talks about Satan, and it says all the things that he says about himself. And the reason why he fell, he kept saying, I am this, I am that, I. It's all about his pride and his not wanting to submit to God the Father and the God of the universe. And so he fell, and he took, a third of the angels with him. And it was all about pride. So Paul wants to be humble and stay humble. And I'll tell you, if you go to Amazon and look up Christian Living, or you were to go to a bookstore, which they still have them, believe it or not, you can go to a Christian bookstore. But if you were to try to find the section on humility, you're going to have a very hard time finding it. Most people don't want to talk about humility. It doesn't find itself into our culture, but it should be. It should be one of the biggest sections there. If we look out at the world, humility is not something that is revered. If you look at the celebrities that are around, Hollywood or whatever, find me a humble one. They're very hard to find. You might find some, but it's very hard to find them. They're about themselves. They're about how they look. They're about how they think that they're superior to everybody. Go to the pro athlete next. Find me a humble pro athlete. Boy, is that hard to find. Usually after the game is over, they're sitting there telling you how great they are, right? How they're so much better than the other person. Most people are not running around trying to be humble. And the real reason is because true humility can only survive in the presence of God. We must recognize how awesome God is, how amazing God is, how far superior he is to us. Then we can start to begin to humble ourselves before the mighty hand of God when we recognize those things. It's a hard quality to come by, but it's an appropriate response to understanding the presence of God. These false apostles, these false prophets, they're full of pride. So in verse number 22, Paul started in by talking about himself. And if you remember in verse number 21, he said, I speak foolishly. In other words, he's saying, I don't want to do this. It's not something that I have on my docket to do, but I'm going to be bold and I'm going to tell it how it is. And I'm going to do this in a humble fashion, and I'm not going to do it out of pride. He starts off by listing some things that they are, that he is their equal. So he at least begins by saying, I'm their equal, right? Are they Hebrews? So am I, in verse 22. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. So he starts off by saying, you know what? We're equal in these areas. I'm qualified to be an apostle. Verse 23 then. He says, are they ministers of Christ? It's a question. And he says, I speak as a fool. And what he's saying there is, you know what? Far be it from me to call them a minister of Christ. They're nothing close to a minister of Christ. They're a minister of Satan. They're an angel of darkness presenting themselves as an angel of light. And so I say this foolishly. Are they ministers of Christ? He says, I am more. And then he goes through here and starts telling you how he is more of a minister of Christ than they are. In labors, more abundant. And what he means by labors is just he has to go out and work. He has to go out and do the work of an evangelist. He has to make his own way. He's supplying his own money. And in particular, when it comes to being persecuted, he is persecuted more than they are. So in labors, more abundant. In stripes, above measure. And so he's talking about how many times he's been beaten. And this is just being beaten by the average everyday person. This isn't even talking about being arrested and being beaten. He's just simply saying, you know what, as I go around the countryside, someone might attack me. Then he says, in prisons, more frequent. I've been in prison more than any of them. We know of at least 7 times Paul was in prison, right? In deaths often. My life was always in danger. Verse 24, of the Jews, 5 times that received I 40 stripes, save one. So we know that the Jews beat him. And how many times did they beat him? 5 times. And how many times did they beat him? They would whip him, and they whipped him 39 times. And I told you last time that's because you were allowed to hit someone 40 times, and they would only whip you 39 times in case they lost track of count and accidentally hit you one too many times. So if they hit you one too many times, then you're in trouble. Now it's your time to get lashed. So they would whip you 39 times to make sure that they didn't break the law. Then he says thrice, so 5 times by the Jews, 3 times he was beaten with rods, and that's at least 8 times that he was whipped and beaten, right? Now these rods would be like usually a bunch of rods that were kind of tied together. They were they'd be used like a whip, and they would whip back and forth, and they weren't rigid. They were, and you know what that's like if someone hits you with something that would bend, and then it swipes and gets you hard, that's what they would hit you with, and it would hurt like the dickens. And they beat him with rods. Once was I stoned, and when you're stoned, you're always left for dead. Like, they don't stone you to let you live. The people would stone you. Whoever was around there would throw rocks at you, and they would get you down on the ground. Usually you'd probably lay there and try to protect yourself. If you would know what it's like to have rocks thrown at you, get hit by something, you know what that would be like to kind of protect your organs. But then at the end, they would lay you out, and someone would take a great big huge rock and either crush your head or crush your sternum with it. And so they would leave you to die, like you're to die when that happens. But God made sure that he didn't die. But he was stoned. Sounds like a horrible thing to go through. That's what he did. Then he says, 3 times he suffered shipwreck. Well, back then, shipwrecks were more common than they are today. But that's a scary thing. And you didn't usually live through a shipwreck either. And to live through 3 shipwrecks is amazing. It says, a night and a day I have been in the deep. When he talks about a night and a day being in the deep, the deep all through the Bible is reference of being out to sea. And so a night and a day, he was in a boat, if you will, being beaten around, and the boat was probably lashing back and forth, and everybody was afraid of being shipwrecked anyways. And so he's gone through all of those things. Now he's going to add to this. You think, if that was all that happened to you in your life, you've lived kind of an amazing life, right? Paul's going to add to it now. Verse 26. He says, in journeyings often. He had 3 major missionary journeys that we know of. With that, there was many other trips that he did. He would go from place to place. While he was doing those things, while he was journeying, he is in danger. He is always in threatening circumstances. So he says, in journeyings often, that's verse 26. And with those journeys then, he was in perils of water. So back in those days, there's water, not just lakes and seas like Paul was talking about being on a boat, but I think the waters he's talking about here are rivers in particular. When it was time to cross a river, guess what? You don't just have a bridge that goes over the Grand River. You got to go through it by foot normally, or figure it out. If it was a huge thoroughfare, they might have a better way of going across. But a lot of times, especially Paul with his missionary journeys, he's just trying to figure out how to go through a river. Well, they have flash flooding. You don't necessarily know what the river is like where you're crossing. And if you know rivers, they change all the time, don't they? One time you might go through and it might have a bunch of shallow areas that you can go through. The next time it'll all have washed out right in the middle, and you'll step down and you'll just go down the river, right? Because it's rushing through there. We hear from our missionaries, the Browns, when they go traveling out into the jungles. One of the things that they have to do sometimes is cross that river. And if they've had a lot of rain, you know what's happened? They walked a whole day into the jungle, got to the river, can't cross it. It's rushing way too hard, so they turn around and go back home, right? Especially for Cecilia. She's not as strong as Bob. So they turn around and go home. Paul, he was in danger, in perils of water. Then he says this, in perils of robbers. If you're traveling around the ancient world, whether you're by yourself or with some people, it was best to travel with others because you don't know what you're going to come across. Back then, they had the highways that you would walk on, and they would have what's called highwaymen or robbers. In Acts in chapter 13, you have Paul. He's going from Perga to Antioch of Pisidia, and he traveled the Taurus Mountains. That's a rugged terrain. He's traveling alone. He had to ford two dangerous flood-prone rivers while he was doing that. And as you would go through those mountains, you know where the robbers would tend to stay? Hidden behind some rocks. If you watched like the old Western movies, and you'd be riding between the two mountains or whatever, where would the robbers always be? The bad guys. They're always on the top, right? And they'd come out from behind the rocks and get you. Well, if you're traveling all alone and you're walking alone and all of a sudden 5 guys come from behind the rocks, what do you think you're going to do? You're like, oh, here we go, right? Because you know what's going to happen. You think of the story of the Good Samaritan. What happened to the guy? He got beat up and robbed and left at the side of the road. And no one wanted to get involved. You know why? Because they didn't want to get beaten up and robbed too. If they help this guy, maybe those guys are still around and they're going to step around and say, what are you doing? Right? So you just walk by him and leave him be. Those robbers are there. Paul, in his journeys, had to traverse those things. He was in perils of robbers. What's the next one? So verse 26, in journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen. Well, his own countrymen are the Jews. The Jews hated him. Why did they hate him so much? Well, because he'd go to town and he'd go into the synagogues if they had one, and he would preach. And he would tell them, you got it all wrong. You missed the Messiah. He was here. And they didn't like it. So they hated him. They sought his life everywhere. Some people, when he was in the synagogues, believed, and they got saved. The rest generally got angry, got hostile. They lashed out in fury, and they sought his life. So he was in danger of his own countrymen. What else does it say then? In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils of the heathen. That's the Gentiles. So guess what? The Jews are after you. To a lesser extent, the Gentiles are after you too. Who can you trust? Who's your friend? That's everybody, isn't it? In Philippi, in Acts in chapter 16, he was thrown into the Philippian jail. He was in danger. In Acts in chapter 19, there's a riot that starts in Ephesus. He was in danger. The Gentiles were after him too. All right, so what does it say? In journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robber, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city. So if he goes into a city, guess what? They know who Paul is. They're after him. in Jerusalem, in Ephesus, in Philippi, in Iconium, in Lystra, in Thessalonica, in Berea, in Corinth. All of those places that he went to, he was in danger of people killing him. All of those places had bad things happen to him. Imagine traveling around the world, and when you arrive there, that's how you are greeted. That was Paul. So after in perils in the city, then he says in perils in the wilderness. Well, so if he goes into a city, he's in peril. Now if he goes into the wilderness, he's in peril. And if he goes into the city that's Jews, he's in peril. And if he goes into a city that's the Gentiles, he's in peril. Now if he goes out into the wilderness, guess what? He has exposure to the elements. There's cold, there's rain, there's snow, there's wild animals, there's robbers. And guess what? If a robber finds you in the middle of nowhere, you have no help. At least if you're in a city, maybe someone might see it and help, right? Where else is he in perils? In perils in the wilderness? In perils in the sea. We already told you that he had been wrecked before. There was storms. The sea can be dangerous. I can tell you one time I was on Lake Michigan. I was fishing. And when you go to Lake Michigan, down there in New Buffalo, you don't just fish right there when you get to the lake. You got to go. The further north you go, the quicker Lake Michigan drops off. So down there by New Buffalo, it stays shallow, 50 feet of water for quite some time. So sometimes you got to get into 60, 80 feet of water. You go so far from shore you can barely see the land. And then many times I would go up north by what's called Union Pier. That's when Chicago burned down, there were some piers there that they used to bring lumber to take over to Chicago. And the piers are gone now, but Union Pier is left. And we'd go up there and go fishing. Well, I remember fishing one time, and I heard this noise. I said, oh, what's that noise? And all these boats were like driving back towards the river. And I thought, I wonder what's going on. And I looked over to the west. There's this great big, huge black cloud with lightning coming out of it. And I'm miles in Lake Michigan. And back in those days, I didn't have a cell phone, and I didn't have a CB radio, walkie-talkie, nothing. I am just in Lake Michigan with that coming on us. And I said, I was with a guy named Todd, I think. I said, Todd, I think we better go in. And we pulled up anchor and just went as fast as we could. And by about the time we hit the river, it started pouring rain on us so hard. But we were thankful to be in the river and not be on Lake Michigan with like 12-foot waves or something, because that happens pretty fast sometimes. Paul, when he was in the sea, he had those things happen to him. What else? Who else? What else is he in peril of? In perils in the sea, in perils among the false brethren. These are people pretending to be Christians that are not Christians. They're really there to destroy you. Judas. He is the false brother. People come alongside you. And Galatians 2:4 says, the false brethren who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty. That's wolves in sheep's clothing. They're there to get you. You guys think you got it hard? Those false apostles that you're talking about, they know nothing about this. I have experienced all of these things, and they're living in the lap of luxury. I am more of a minister of Christ than them by a long shot. Now, verse 27. What else is going on? In weariness and painfulness. Paul had to work. And we've talked about that a couple of different times, right? Paul worked. He was a hard worker. He made his way. He worked with leather. He made tents. We call him a tent maker, but he worked with leather. And so when we look at the life of Paul, he's spending a lot of time working with his hands all day long. And then at night, what does he have to do? He's preparing sermons. He's ministering. He's getting ready for the next day. He's spending up late at night, if you will, writing and doing God's work. That word weariness, by the way, means to work to the point of exhaustion. The word painfulness means hardship, and it's related to prolonged trials and difficultiness. He was tired. He was weary. And then he follows that up by saying, and watchings often. That means he's up at night. You say, well, how do you know that he was up at night? Because it says right there, in watchings often. Now, you would naturally read that and think, oh, he was up at night because he was afraid of people breaking in and getting him, right, or killing him. That's not what that carries here. Instead of sleeping, he's working. He's studying at night. And guess what? I see some guy here. I don't know why. Some guy here just preached a 72-hour sermon. I think that's what it was. He broke the world record for preaching the longest sermon. I have no idea what he said. I just saw that he was doing it. And in the picture, someone's handing him some water because I'm sure the throat was getting pretty sore after that. But guess what? In Acts in chapter 20, Paul preached a long sermon. Sometimes you say, Pastor Matt, you preach some long sermons. Not compared to Paul. Paul preached a long sermon. He started in the morning. And as nighttime came, he's up on the third story, if you will. A guy is sitting in a window. He falls asleep. He falls out the window, and he dies. They went down and they raised him up from the dead. They brought him back up because Paul wasn't finished. Paul preached until the morning. He preached 24 hours. Now, I've had some people fall asleep in my messages, but I'm thankful to say no one's died from one of my messages. But Paul had someone die. Of course, they raised him from the dead. Paul was weary, always working, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst. We've already known a little bit about that, right? Paul said, when I was there with you, I had need. But the Macedonians heard about it, came down and helped. It's hard to go hungry, isn't it? It's hard to be thirsty. He says in fastings often. In other words, I had to go long periods of time without eating sometimes. Man, that's hard to do. Don't like that. Never had to do that in my lifetime. In cold and nakedness. Imagine him. He's hungry. He's thirsty. He's huddled in the corner trying to stay warm. Probably writing. Thinking about the next day. Thinking about how he can minister. Working with his hands. He's tired. He's weary. If he goes out, people are there to hurt him. To kill him. It's tough. Many pastors should be ashamed because they don't want hardship in the ministry. They want everything to be easy. And when the hardships come, they whine about it and they leave. I've seen pastors demand a certain salary or they'll go somewhere else. One of my brothers candidated to go be a pastor at a church, and they didn't call him. They called some other guy. They told the other guy his salary was going to be like $50,000 a year or something like that. The guy says, I can't live off of that. You have to give me $75,000 a year. And they said, well, we can't. And so he said, well, I'm not coming. So then they asked my brother if he wanted to come for $50,000 a year. If God's called you to a ministry, he'll take care of the money, won't he? And yes, it might mean that some things are hard, but it's okay. God will supply. It's hard for me to see pastors that just need it so easy for themselves. That wasn't Paul. Paul went through all of this. His faith never diminished. The second credential to be a true apostle is Paul had this experience of sympathy. Look at what he says in verse 28. Besides those things, so I have many things that I could give more examples, but I'm not going to do it. So besides those things that are without, in other words, they're without, I'm not going to talk about them. I could go on. Paul could write manuscript the size of the Bible with all the hardships that he went through. So he says, besides all those things, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. He says there's daily pressure upon me. I have great sympathy. Why is Paul working so hard? Why is Paul willing to go cold? I mean, at one point in time, he had to tell someone to go get his cloak, right? Someone had his cloak. Why did someone have his cloak? Probably that guy was cold, and Paul gave it to him and said, here, stay warm. And then Paul needed it, and he said, go get my cloak for me. I'm going to die without it, right? I'm in better position than him right now. He says, I'm willing to go through all those things. Why? Because I care for the church. I've literally laid my life on the line for the church. I've literally been left for dead. I've been shipwrecked. I've been beaten. I've been in jail. I've been hungry. I've been thirsty. I've been cold. I've been out in the wilderness. All because I love the church. Imagine if every church pastor was like that. Imagine if every church pastor was willing to put his life on the line for the people in his congregation. In most cases, it's not the way it is. In most cases, he's using that church so that he can get to the next place, the bigger and better place. Imagine pastors like that. Nothing will ever stop them from loving. How deep is Paul's love? So he says, besides those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. Verse 29, who is weak? And am I not weak? Who is offended? And I burden not. He says, you're weak, I'm weak. That's real sympathy. I will be weak for you. I will help you. You suffer, I'll suffer with you. You're cold, here's my cloak. I'll be cold instead. You need something, here I have it. I'll give it to you. God will take care of my needs. I'll help you. You have some emotional pain. I'll have some emotional pain with you. False teachers don't care anything except themselves. Paul is the opposite of that. You're offended? I'll burn with you. Meaning, I'll be offended with you. I'll help you. I'll encourage you. I'll be there for you. I might not completely understand every circumstance that you're in, but I will stand behind you. I will help lift you up. I will help encourage you. I will help getting you back into a good spot. The false teachers were exploiting them. Paul was helping them. Oh, we need more pastors like that. It's a very encouraging message for this pastor to try to be humble, try to encourage, try to be loving and there for the people. It's not always the easiest thing. We're all unlovely in a little way, but we're all lovable because we're in God's family and we're made in the image of God, and you deserve our love. Let's have a word of prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we do just thank you for this message that you've given. Paul comparing himself to the false teachers, those that just care about themselves, declare themselves wise, declare themselves great, declare themselves amazing. Paul said they're not ministers. And in a humble way, he says, look at all these things that I've had to endure. This is what the true apostle looks like. Willing to give, willing to lay his life on the line, willing to love even when no one else is willing. Father, I pray that we would keep that in front of us at all times. May the pastor of this church be willing to live his life that way, and then may the congregation be willing to do the same. Father, we ask these things in your name. Amen.